Hello and welcome to this week's Liverpool.com podcast. I'm Matt Addison. Michael Plant is with me as we go through and take a look at the Liverpool attacking options this summer. There's been plenty of changes already happened or mooted for the future as well. And with still more than a month to go in the transfer window, there could be plenty more activity to get stuck into. So we are going to have a bit of a chat around that today. And I think there's probably only one place to start, Michael. Hugo Ekitike has emerged as the leading contender to come in next for Liverpool. The medical has begun, at the very least, at the time of recording. I'm sure by the time people listen to this, there may be another update in terms of him coming to Liverpool as well. But we should start with him, shouldn't we? He appears to be one that Liverpool are prepared to go fairly big for. I think I was slightly surprised in terms of the fee. But what have you made of that deal and kind of the steps, shall we say, that have made it come to the fore in terms of Liverpool going for him?
Yeah, it was a fun week last week, wasn't it, with Isak and Ekitike and all these updates. But look, I mean, he's clearly the second choice for Liverpool, and I don't think there's any shame in that. I think Isak is by far and away the best option in the market. He is one of the best strikers in the world. I think, excluding Erling Haaland, he's probably the only striker in the world under the age of about 26 who you would really kind of describe as world class. So, but he is unavailable this summer. Newcastle have been very clear about that, although there obviously are a few rumours still floating around. And it seems pretty clear to me that Isak has been unsettled at the very least by what's happened this summer. And obviously the fact that he didn't play at the weekend for Newcastle was a big hint that maybe perhaps his head has been turned a little bit. Comments from his agent as well come out publicly. So, but I think after that, I do think that Ekitike is the best option available in the market. Not necessarily in terms of a striker to come in and immediately hit the ground running. I think if they really just wanted to go for a natural goal scorer who will come in and immediately contribute, I think they probably would have looked more at Osimhen or someone like Gyökeres. But I think in terms of more of a project, I think that Ekitike ticks all the boxes. He's a bit of a Swiss Army knife of a player, really, in terms of all the things he brings. He's capable of dropping deep, stretching defences, comfortable drifting out wide as well. He's tall, he's fast, and he really actually ticks a lot of boxes of what you would want for a centre forward. And obviously, you and I have kind of done our research and reading up on him over the last week or so since this news has developed. And I think I have to say he's a really, really interesting signing who will bring new dimensions to the way Liverpool play this season. I mean, it's something I've gone on about all summer. Arne Slot has really added speed and penetration, I think, in his signings this summer. And I think what's also interesting about Ekitike is his ability to link with teammates as well on the pitch. And I think him and Wirtz could, for instance, strike up a really interesting partnership. The only one slight downside, I think, that from reading up on his stats and his numbers over the last couple of years is perhaps his finishing isn't quite at the level of maybe some of the elite strikers out there. But look, he's 23, plenty of opportunity to grow. Agree with you, it's a lot of money, but probably that is the going rate, I think, for one of the top strikers in Europe. So, yeah, really interesting signing that, as you said, when the recording goes out, could well be a Liverpool player by that stage. It could be expected to move pretty quickly. But yeah, I'm interested in what your thoughts are on it, Matt. Do you think it's a good signing? And yeah, what were your thoughts in general on it?
Yeah, I mean, I'd echo a lot of what you've said, really. The price surprised me, but then the more I've thought about it, the more you just think that maybe is just the market this summer. As you say, there's not really loads of players, so there's going to be a premium on the ones that are available and who are going to move. You would look at Eintracht Frankfurt as a team that has tended to get big fees as well. I think they got even more for Kolo Muani, wasn't it? The move from there to PSG, they paid more. Omar Marmoush was slightly less, but generally speaking, they've tended to be pretty hard to negotiate with, and I think Liverpool have obviously done a decent job to get it down to what they've done. By the sounds of it, the release clause was higher. It could have cost them even more in the end. So the price is high, and I think that will give a little bit of a pressure on him from the outside to hit the ground running. But I would say as well at the same time that Liverpool have got other options. We're going to go on and speak about some of the other options that they might go and sign. But even at the moment, you'd look at it and think, well, if Hugo Ekitike is a kind of Fabinho type signing where it takes him 6 months and then suddenly it clicks, that's absolutely fine. It doesn't have to be the case that he comes in and is in the starting 11 for that game against Bournemouth in the middle of August to start the season. It can be a bit more of a gradual process. I think it's probably going to have to be because of his age, and he's basically had one season at the level that you would really want to take a punt at that kind of money on. I think there's risks attached to it. It's not perfect, but it's probably as close to a guarantee as you could get, really. And it's a typical Liverpool signing as well, I would say, in a lot of ways. He's obviously gone to PSG and it hasn't quite worked, but Liverpool have tracked him for a long, long time. Even before he went to PSG, he was on Liverpool's radar and plenty of other clubs as well, I'm sure, around Europe. But yeah, it feels like one where there's been long-standing interest. It's not come out of the blue for them. They know exactly what they're going to get. And generally speaking, when the people behind the scenes at Liverpool go for a player like this, it does tend to work. So I think there's definitely a level of trust there, certainly. You mentioned Alexander Isak as well. Obviously, he would be the dream for most people. It seems like there is still, sort of rumblings of what might happen. We don't quite know what the outcome of that is going to be. Again, by the time this podcast comes out, maybe we'll know a little bit more. I think Newcastle fly out for their pre-season tour later this week, so I assume that he will be going with them for that unless there's an injury behind the scenes that prevents it. But, I mean, what have you made of that situation as well? I can understand why Liverpool would have tried to do that deal and tried to go for it. Equally, it's not a surprise that Newcastle are very insistent that he shouldn't go anywhere. But, I mean, from his perspective, I think it would probably be fair to say that it's a move or a transfer that he would give a lot of consideration to. Newcastle in the Champions League in a good position, of course, but Liverpool obviously in a very different situation at the moment.
Yeah, and I'm surprised how much of a story Isak has become, to be honest with you. I didn't think it was going to be much of a goer this summer in terms of, there's always speculation, isn't there? But I didn't really think it would amount to a huge amount. And look, I think from Newcastle's perspective, it seems relatively calm from them. I don't think Eddie Howe seems particularly worried. I mean, I think he even said something along the lines of he expects him to be a Newcastle player this season. So they have seemed to be pretty calm with it. I think that Newcastle actually, reading elsewhere, seem to be a bit of a club, and I was going to use the word crisis. That's probably the wrong phrase. It's probably a bit too dramatic, but they're certainly in a bit of transition away from the pitch in terms of boardroom level and some of the executives coming and going and stuff. So I think that perhaps means it's a little bit unsettled. But listen, I think you and I both know there's no smoke without fire very often with these sorts of stories. There's talk about him wanting an increased contract, a huge weekly salary. Of course, he didn't train, did he, with Newcastle's team on, Wednesday? He didn't train with them on Tuesday. Reports have come out since it was due to a minor knock. And then, of course, the club have come out and confirmed that he is flying to the Far East with the club in their pre-season tour. So, yeah, I'm surprised how much of a story it's become. I think the question now is he still available? And if so, could Liverpool hypothetically bring in both Isak and Ekitike? I think you and I will probably have the same opinion on that one. And it looks difficult. I don't know what your thoughts are. I think it'd be possible to get both of them in and all.
I think economically, financially, from a Liverpool perspective, it wouldn't necessarily be an issue. I know there's been a lot of talk about how much Liverpool have spent, and it is unusual for Liverpool to have gone as big as what they've gone, but it's still feasible that in the next 6 weeks they bring in £200 million worth of players in terms of the outgoings, something close to that when you think of all the names that we could go through. So it's not completely off the table when you think of how little they've spent as well. But I do think Newcastle are in a bit of a tricky situation in that they've clearly said that he's worth in excess of 120 million, probably closer to 150 million that they would want for him. But then at the same time, you have to then give him the wages and the salary that match up to that. You can't picture a player of being essentially what you are saying is one of the top 3 or 5 players in the world, but then refuse to pay them any more than what he's on now. That seems to be where this story that he wants an increase in salary comes from, and that can potentially cause problems and friction moving forward. So I don't think it's the end of this story by any stretch, but yeah, of course, the dream scenario would see Liverpool bring him and Hugo Ekitike in, and that would be a perfect scenario, really, where you have the established, but you also have the next one coming through, and it takes the pressure off Ekitike even more to hit the ground running. But yeah, it doesn't feel particularly likely at the moment. But then, things can change and have changed quickly in the transfer window so far. So yeah, I wouldn't completely rule it out. But I don't know where do you stand on that? It's hard to put a percentage chance or anything like that. But what are your initial thoughts on that situation as things stand as we record?
Very, very, very low, verging on impossible. I just can't see a way that they spend that sort of money again on the player. I do take your point that there is obviously going to be player sales in the next couple of weeks, and could that finance a deal? PSR-wise, Liverpool are in a very strong position, and FSG, have proven they will always make an exception for an outstanding talent, which would very much, identify Isak as one. But are they also going to be willing to finance such a big transfer when you've already brought in Ekitike? I think as well, reading between the lines, the Newcastle win for Ekitike, it maybe seems to have suddenly spurred Liverpool on to think, we have to move here if we're going to get him. And of course, listen, there was an approach for Isak last week. It wasn't an official bid, but Liverpool did inquire about his availability. It was knocked back, and here we are. So I don't think we will see Alexander Isak in a Liverpool shirt next season. Not impossible, but very, very unlikely. And I think that one thing that maybe we need to think about with Isak as well is that we look at it from a very Liverpool-centric lens. But if you think about it from Isak's perspective, Liverpool aren't the only club out there. Barcelona is a great example that at some point they're going to have to find a replacement for Lewandowski. Could that be a move that perhaps in a year's time could be, more viable, maybe especially if he doesn't sign a new contract as well. Bayern Munich as well. Harry Kane, what's he? I think he's 31, 32 at this stage. So that could be another option as well. So it's not just Liverpool we do need to think of in the Alexander Isak conversation, but I would be surprised, very, very surprised if we see him in a red shirt come the 2nd of September.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think that's broadly where everybody's at the moment. But I do think it's going to be interesting. Like you say, is he going to sign a new contract? Is he going to, is he going to just bide his time at Newcastle and see what happens next? Like I say, I think it's very much not the end of the story with Isak, even though it might be very slim chances for this summer, and we'll just have to see how those things kind of unfold. But let's move on and talk about a few other players in the forward line. I think there's certainly a lot more certainty around some of those players and whether they might be moving compared to Alexander Isak, at least. I'll group Darwin Nunez and Federico Chiesa together. We'll start with those two for the time being. I very much of the opinion that it makes sense for them both to move on for slightly different reasons, but I think it ultimately makes sense for them both to go and find new clubs this summer and go on and try and further their careers elsewhere. Is your expectation that both of those will move on as well this summer? Obviously, it depends on the bids and things that come in and the level of interest. But for Nunez and Chiesa, as we've said with Isak, we've got to think of their perspective as well, not just the Liverpool perspective. To me, it just makes all the sense in the world that they would move on.
Yeah. There's definitely interest in Nunez. There has been all summer, and quite a bit of interest for a player who hasn't had a good season, really. Hasn't had a good 12 months. I think it's interesting that he's had a very good start to pre-season as well. There certainly doesn't seem to be any issues in terms of his motivation or in terms of his performance levels at this stage of the summer. I think he will go. I don't think it'd be the end of the world if he stayed, Nunez, especially if you do have that other option in Ekitike. But I would be surprised if he's a Liverpool player come September. Chiesa, I mean, there are so many reports about interest from Italy. Again, you suspect there's no smoke without fire. He's been repeatedly linked with a number of Italian clubs throughout summer. The big one that keeps coming up is Napoli, who seem to be linked with everyone, though, this summer. I will add that little point. But and AC Milan have been linked. I think Juventus and moved back to his former club has been mooted as well. I think there has been as well even a couple of links to Turkey and Spain. So I think that in reality, he is clearly not fancied by Arne Slot. I mean, when you think about it, that he actually didn't start a Premier League game last season in his preferred position. The only game he started up front. So he just does not fancy him in those wide areas. Slot, and I noticed in the friendly against Stoke, he also played up front again. So he's clearly not a player that the Slot fancies. He hasn't travelled with the squad to Hong Kong. No kind of official reason given for that, but you suspect it probably is related to his future and the uncertainty surrounding that. I think I would be surprised to see either player as Liverpool players come the end of the transfer window.
Yeah, I mean, for Chiesa in particular, he just didn't get a chance, did he? You mentioned the Stoke game. He was up front as well for the Preston game. And I mean, it was always going to be a big summer, I think, in terms of Chiesa getting himself fit to begin with, but then getting himself into a position where he could actually show what he could do. He just didn't look the quickest in that Preston game. I think that would be an understatement to say that. I think there's definitely a lack of pace in there, which I think Liverpool very much would want from a player in that position, somebody who can run in behind and get away from defenders. I think is fundamental for what they're looking for, and obviously even more so out wide as well, to be able to beat a man and have that acceleration. It just doesn't look like he's quite got that, obviously. The suggestion seems to be that he's got a little bit of a knock, which is why he isn't on the pre-season tour. But whatever the sort of reason behind that is, the bottom line is it's not good for his future, for him not to be there and not to be involved. And even if he wasn't fully involved in the sessions, you'd be able to kind of see what Arne Slot is trying to put across tactically. He'd be in with his teammates. He'd be learning, even if he wasn't on the pitch and playing in the games, against AC Milan at the weekend, for example. So, yeah, it's a tricky one, I think, to see a route to minutes for him in particular. For Darwin Nunez as well, though, I mean, it just feels like last season it felt very much like the end of the line, really, for him. He'd got to a point where he wasn't really favoured. He didn't really start for the last few months of the season. When he did, it was bits and pieces. It wasn't really his best season, even by the other two standards of the other two seasons that he'd been at Liverpool, which weren't unbelievably amazing. This was probably the most disappointing one for him in the context. I just feel like it's time for both of them to move on. But the question, like you say, is who's going to come to the table. Again, Napoli is a team that has been linked with Darwin Nunez, but it looks like they've looked elsewhere now for who they might go for. Saudi Arabia, I'm just not convinced that would be a move that would particularly appeal to him at this point in his career. And then it's a case of who else comes in for him. So there's definitely a couple of question marks there. I think we'll probably find out a little bit more in the next couple of weeks where they stand, and we'll probably get a few clues in the pre-season games as well of who plays in those and who gets the most minutes and who's in the stronger team and who's in the weaker team if they're playing at a couple of different teams across the course of those games. Yeah, for me, it feels like both of them are to move on. That probably makes sense. In the case of Chiesa, you probably don't need a replacement. In the case of Darwin Nunez, maybe you do. Maybe that's Hugo Ekitike.
Yeah, potentially. I think you definitely need to bring in. Well, I mean, Ekitike is going to come in. I think he could be the replacement for Nunez, and then I think that between, as I'm sure we'll come on to talk about, Luis Diaz in a minute and Chiesa, I think if they were to both leave, there would have to be a replacement in the wide areas, and I'm sure we'll come on to that in a second. But yeah, I think in terms of up front, I mean, listen, Jadon Downs is a player that is well liked by Liverpool and by Arne Slot. He's been injured for a while now. He had a stress fracture in his back over the end of last season, but he is fit again and could have travelled with the squad to Hong Kong. But I think there was a sense from Liverpool that, given the issues that he's had recently, that perhaps just remaining at the AXA training centre over the next 2 weeks, not having to travel and put his body through that, is probably best for him. And I think he's going to look to increase his sessions over the next couple of weeks. So I think he could have a role to play next season as a backup striker. And yeah, I also think that Trey Niami, who's played a lot in pre-season as well, and Rio and Gamoa could come into these conversations as well about the squad. So we'll have to see about that one. But I do think that if we do see kind of 2-3 attacking players leave, that they are going to have to look for replacements, particularly, I think, in the wide areas.
Yeah, I mean, wide forward does look like the obvious one, doesn't it? There's been links with Rodrigo at Real Madrid, which, I mean, if that was a transfer that would come off, I mean, that would be quite incredible, really, to bring in another player of that quality. But I guess for Liverpool to be convinced that Luis Diaz possibly might be sellable, which I think the club stance has been fairly strong up to this point, that they want to keep him. If you're going to find an improvement to Luis Diaz, it is going to have to be a player of that level, isn't it?
And I think Rodrigo would be an improvement. I think he's fantastic. Oh, yeah. Saw him play in the flesh a handful of times as well, and he was outstanding every single time. Obviously, Brazil international player who very often starts, up until last season, was a regular starter for Real Madrid. I mean, it's kind of the level of player we're talking about, 24. Wow, if he became an option. So I think Liverpool's stance on Luis Diaz could change pretty quickly, really. And as well, I should add that he was essentially a backup for the Club World Cup under Xabi Alonso. I think he started the first game and then was a sub for the next 4. Didn't play in 2 of them, if I'm not mistaken. So, yeah, you really do start to wonder whether actually that could be a goer. And listen, there's not, once you're leaving Real Madrid, many clubs in world football can you go to, really? There's only a handful, and Liverpool are certainly in that conversation. So that would be an incredible bit of business if there is any possibility of making it happen. And in terms of Diaz, look, as you said, Liverpool's stance all summer has been he is not for sale. He is kind of seen as with a valuation of in around 100 million euros. I think that's 87 million pounds in around that kind of figure. You do suspect that maybe if you're starting to push up towards 70, 80, whether Liverpool's ears might kind of prick up a little bit and there might be a bit of interest. But one thing I would say, despite all the reports of his desires and his wants to leave, there doesn't seem to be any issue in terms of attitude. I watched the behind-the-scenes video from training the other week, and he looked as motivated as anyone. Look, I mean, the club aren't probably going to put out if he throws a tantrum and storms off the pitch, but, it was a little insight into the fact that there doesn't seem to be any issue with his training so far. And, yeah, I think that I think there's a real possibility that Diaz does leave this summer, if I'm honest.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think that seems to be the mood music at the moment around him, and what the talk around him is. It's almost that I'd be happy either way if he stays. Clearly, he's a very, very good player and was a key member of the squad under Arne Slot. He can play, as we mentioned before, on the left. He can play through the middle. That's something that Liverpool might need. Obviously, Rodrigo can do that as well, but that's not necessarily a deal that's going to happen. Guaranteed. You've already got Luis Diaz, so that's a completely different situation. But yeah, it feels like one in a normal summer where there's less things going on and less things happening and less moves to make. Maybe that's one that you look to do and you think, yeah, okay, it's the right time for both parties. I just wonder whether if you get into the point where only Mohamed Salah and Cody Gakpo remain of the forward options from last season, that's quite a lot, isn't it, to do in one position in one summer. So, look, if Luis Diaz stays, I think there's definitely positives. If he goes, it'll be because Liverpool get a fee that they think is massively higher and more than what they thought they were going to get at the start of the summer, and suddenly that conversation maybe changes. But yeah, it does feel a bit to me like Liverpool would need to do a lot more work in the market if Luis Diaz was to go, even after Hugo Ekitike, because if, as it stands, Gakpo, Ekitike to come, Salah, Diaz, Nunez and Chiesa, okay, you can sell Federico Chiesa and not have to replace him, but that leaves you with 5. If Nunez goes, you're down to 4. 4 doesn't really feel like enough when you look at the evidence of last season. Liverpool were slightly fortunate, I would suggest, in terms of injuries. Now, obviously, it's not all good luck and that kind of thing.
Add that line in.
There's lots of other things, but equally, you can be just as likely to get an unlucky thing that, again, might not be anybody's fault, might not be anything you can do about it. But the first game of next season, if someone breaks their leg, there's nothing you can do about it, and suddenly they're out for a long period of time. So I think 5 is the minimum in terms of senior options. You've then got Rio and Gamola. We don't know what's going to happen with Ben Doak. I know there's a lot of interest in him, whether he could be one that would stick around. I suspect that if he doesn't get sold, he will probably go out on loan, because he's a player that is very, very much ready to play senior football somewhere, if not at Liverpool. But to me, five senior forwards feels like the ideal number. But for Liverpool to even get to that point from this point in the summer, it still feels like there's a fair bit of work to do to get to that number.
Yeah, I suppose you maybe you can have an elite 4 or 5, and then you can have players that can chip in. Frimpong being an example. Could Harvey Elliott play, as one of the wide positions as well, if he does end up staying? I suspect in the conversation of players leaving, I think Doak and Elliott will probably leave this summer. But, and you forget as well, we keep talking about the transfer window. It's still another 6 weeks to run on the window. There's still a lot of time to do business. And although I did suddenly realise the other day that we're 3 weeks away from the Premier League season starting, which is, where's the summer going suddenly? But there's still plenty of time to get business over the line. But I agree with you that when we have 2 of the front 6 from last season, that would be a huge change really in terms of going into the season. And also, actually, another player we should have mentioned is Florian Wirtz, who can obviously play in that, could play as kind of a number 9 or false 9 as well if needed. So there's lots of options of players that can draft in. But I think this thought that you maybe have 4 or 5 senior options and players you can draft in. It's probably how Slot will look to approach the season. And the other thing that I think is I'm expecting more rotation this season based on a couple of things, but one of them being Slot's comments at the end of last season about the PSG game, when I think he admitted himself that had he rotated more in the weeks leading up to it, they might have been a bit fresher for that game, which again brings in that point that I was saying about the 3 young lads who might maybe step up and play a little bit more as well. And I suppose the only other factor that we've got to talk about as well, and think about, and all the talk of the attackers available, is that Mohamed Salah will be away for, I think, the whole of December, basically, isn't it? And that is a big thing to think about as well when you're planning your attacking options, because December is obviously such a busy period in terms of the fixtures, particularly for the Premier League season. And you've got to think about that. I think that was part of the thinking of bringing in Frimpong as well, a player who can play further up. But whether that does maybe start leading into the Doak and Elliott conversation as well, that you've got those players who can be drafted in and playing as well. So, yeah, but there's still plenty of time. There's going to be plenty of plates being spun metaphorically in the transfer window, and I'm still expecting quite a lot of business and quite a lot of moves out of Liverpool, and then maybe 1 or 2 still to come in, I think.
Yeah, just in the attack, that's 1 or 2 I would suggest, and then maybe they might have to do something somewhere else as well. Look at centre-back, for example. That still feels like a massive priority to me. I mean, it's going to be an interesting few weeks for sure, but I think we will leave it there for this week. We've talked through a lot of different options. I'm sure plenty of people in the comment section will have ideas of what they want Liverpool to do as well. We will have a read of those if you want to stick those into the YouTube comments box and wherever else you are listening to this show. But yeah, thank you to Michael for this week's podcast. I've been Matt Addison as well. We'll be back next week with the next Liverpool.com podcast.